For most of his life, Julian Lennon carried his pain quietly. As the first son of one of the most famous musicians in history, the world assumed privilege, protection, and a charmed upbringing. But behind the legendary last name was a child who grew up feeling overlooked, displaced, and emotionally fractured. Fans long suspected there was deep resentment buried beneath Julian's calm public persona. And now, at 62, he has finally put words to it. In a rare moment of brutal honesty, Julian Lennon admitted that there was one woman he utterly hated for many years. It wasn't a passing frustration or youthful misunderstanding. It was a powerful, lingering resentment rooted in loss, abandonment, and a childhood that changed overnight. For decades, Julian avoided speaking openly about it, choosing diplomacy over truth and silence over confrontation. But time has a way of stripping away fear. With perspective and maturity, Julian no longer feels the need to protect old narratives or soften reality for public comfort. His admission isn't fueled by bitterness, it's shaped by reflection. And the woman at the center of that pain played a role that altered Julian's relationship with his father, his sense of belonging, and his place within a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. This isn't a story about scandal or accusation. It's about a child processing emotional displacement, and a man finally acknowledging feelings he was never allowed to express. What Julian now admits confirms what many fans quietly suspected for years: that behind the music, the interviews, and the legacy, there was unresolved hurt waiting to be named. And once you understand who he's talking about and why, the entire Lennon family story feels very different. Julian Lennon's childhood was shaped by contrasts that few could ever fully understand. On one hand, he carried one of the most famous surnames in the world. On the other, he grew up with a quiet sense of emotional distance that followed him into adulthood. Long before fame, interviews, and expectations, Julian was simply a child trying to understand why his family suddenly felt fractured. When his parents separated, Julian's world changed overnight. Stability gave way to uncertainty, and familiarity was replaced by absence. His father's life moved rapidly into one filled with global attention, creative reinvention, and new relationships. Julian, meanwhile, struggled to find where he fit within that new reality. According to his later reflections, it wasn't the separation itself that caused the deepest pain, but the feeling of being left behind emotionally. As Julian grew older, he became increasingly aware of how narratives were being shaped around him. The public story focused on music, legacy, and reinvention. His private story centered on confusion, displacement, and longing for connection. He learned early that his feelings were inconvenient, that expressing hurt could be misinterpreted as resentment or entitlement. So he stayed quiet. That silence slowly hardened into something more complicated. Julian has admitted that as a child and teenager, he struggled to process his emotions in healthy ways. He didn't yet have the language for grief or emotional abandonment. Instead, those feelings found expression through anger, often directed at the person he believed symbolized everything he had lost. At the time, that resentment felt simple and justified, even if the reality was far more complex. What made the situation more painful was the contrast. Julian observed from the outside. He saw a new family unit forming, one that seemed complete, protected, and emotionally secure. From his perspective, there was little space left for him. Birthdays passed quietly. Moments that should have felt shared felt distant. These experiences reinforced a belief that he had been replaced rather than included. As Julian entered adulthood, the weight of expectation grew heavier. People assumed he had access, support, and privilege simply because of his name. Few recognized the emotional cost of growing up adjacent to fame rather than inside its warmth. Julian felt pressure to be gracious, understanding, and forgiving. Even before he had the chance to fully process what he felt, music became his refuge. Like his father, Julian turned to creativity as a way to translate emotion into something manageable. Through songwriting, he explored themes of longing, loss, and identity. Listeners often sensed the vulnerability in his work, even if they didn't know its source. For Julian, music wasn't about comparison. It was survival. Still, unresolved resentment lingered beneath the surface. Julian has acknowledged that for many years he carried anger he didn't fully understand. It wasn't constant, but it was persistent. And because he didn't feel safe expressing it publicly, it stayed internal, shaping his relationships, his confidence, and his sense of belonging. Looking back now, Julian recognizes that his younger self was responding to emotional pain, not malice. As a child, he lacked context. He saw events through the lens of loss rather than complexity. The woman he would later admit to utterly hating became the focal point of that pain, not because she caused everything, but because she represented change he wasn't ready to accept. This realization didn't come quickly. It took decades of reflection, distance, and emotional growth. But understanding this early is essential to understanding Julian Lennon today. Before forgiveness, before clarity, there was confusion. Before peace, there was resentment. And before the man he is now, there was a child trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. As Julian Lennon moved into his teenage years and early adulthood, the resentment he carried began to take on new layers. What had once felt like a simple, emotional reaction grew more complicated as awareness set in. He started to understand that his anger wasn't rooted in a single person alone, but in the silence, distance, and emotional gaps that followed his childhood. Still, one figure remained central to those feelings: the woman who, in his mind, symbolized a life that continued without him. Julian has since explained that his hatred wasn't born from cruelty or hostility, but from confusion and powerlessness. As a child, he had no control over decisions that reshaped his family. Adults made choices, narratives were formed, and he was expected to adapt quietly. In that environment, resentment became a way to reclaim emotional agency. It gave his pain a direction, even if that direction wasn't entirely fair. Public life made processing those emotions even harder. Every interview, every mention of his father, and every reference to family came with assumptions Julian couldn't correct without reopening wounds. He felt trapped between honesty and diplomacy. Speaking openly risked being misunderstood, while staying silent allowed misconceptions to harden. So he chose restraint, even when it came at a personal cost. As Julian began building his own career, he faced constant comparison, not just musically, but emotionally. People expected him to mirror grace, forgiveness, and maturity long before he felt ready. Few asked whether he had been given the space to grieve what he'd lost. Instead, he was praised most when he minimized his own experience. Over time, that pressure taught him to compartmentalize pain rather than resolve it. Relationships in Julian's adult life were shaped by this unresolved tension. Trust didn't come easily. He guarded his emotions, wary of being sidelined or replaced again. According to his own reflections, it took years for him to recognize how deeply those early wounds influenced his sense of security. The resentment he felt wasn't frozen in the past, it quietly followed him forward. Yet something began to change as Julian gained distance from the intensity of his early fame. With age came perspective, and with perspective came nuance. He started to see the situation not as a single act of loss, but as a complex intersection of adult choices, personal growth, and circumstances beyond any one person's control. This didn't erase the pain, but it softens edges. Julian has been honest about how difficult it was to reframe those emotions. Letting go of resentment meant confronting grief he had postponed for decades. It meant acknowledging that hatred, while protective at first, eventually became a burden. The anger that once gave shape to his pain began to limit his peace. Crucially, Julian learned that understanding didn't require approval. He could recognize complexity without denying his feelings. He could accept that the woman he resented wasn't a villain while still honoring the hurt he experienced as a child. This distinction became central to his healing. It allowed him to hold truth without assigning blame. When Julian later admitted that he had utterly hated her, it wasn't a confession meant to shock. It was an acknowledgement of emotional honesty, a way of naming what had been true for him at one point in his life. By doing so, he reclaimed ownership of his narrative, separating childhood emotion from adult reflection. This stage of his journey marks a turning point. Resentment was no longer something he carried unconsciously. It became something he could examine, contextualize, and eventually release. The hatred he once felt didn't define him, it explained him. Understanding this evolution is essential to understanding Julian Lennon today. His admission isn't about reopening old wounds. It's about recognizing how long healing can take when pain is buried beneath expectation and silence. And as the story continues, it becomes clear that this honesty laid the groundwork for something far more powerful than resentment. Self-awareness. With maturity came a period of deep self-reflection for Julian Lennon, one that fundamentally reshaped how he viewed his past. The anger that once felt justified began to feel heavy. Julian has admitted that there came a point when he realized resentment was no longer protecting him. It was holding him in place. The emotions he had carried since childhood were understandable, but they were also unresolved, quietly influencing his sense of identity and belonging. As he stepped further away from constant public scrutiny, Julian finally had the space to examine those feelings honestly. Without interviews demanding diplomacy or comparisons shaping the narrative, he could ask himself difficult questions. What exactly had he lost? What had he projected onto others? And most importantly, what did holding on to anger actually give him? The answers weren't easy. Julian came to understand that much of his resentment stemmed from grief he had never been allowed to process. As a child, he was expected to adapt quickly to enormous change, not just in his family, but in how the world viewed him. There was no room to pause, no acknowledgement that loss can exist even when success surrounds you. That grief hardened into resentment simply because it had nowhere else to go. Julian also began to see how narratives shaped by adults had influenced his perceptions. He realized that children often internalize change as rejection, even when intentions are more complex. This insight didn't erase the pain, but it helped him contextualize it. The woman he once hated had represented displacement, not because of her actions alone, but because of what her presence symbolized in his young mind. Another crucial shift came when Julian reflected on his relationship with his father. He recognized that his resentment toward one person had sometimes served as a way to avoid confronting deeper feelings of disappointment and longing. Redirecting pain is often easier than facing its true source. This realization was painful but freeing. It allowed Julian to separate emotional truth from emotional convenience. Forgiveness, Julian has emphasized, did not arrive suddenly. It was not a dramatic moment of reconciliation or public closure. Instead, it unfolded gradually through understanding rather than apology. He learned that forgiveness didn't require forgetting or excusing the past. It required releasing the grip it had on his present. As Julian's emotional clarity grew, so did his sense of peace. He no longer felt defined by the role of the overlooked son or the displaced child. He began to see himself as a whole individual, shaped by experience but not confined by it. This shift influenced his creativity as well. His later work reflects introspection rather than longing, insight rather than anger. When Julian speaks today about having utterly hated her, it's with distance and honesty. He's not reliving the emotion, he's acknowledging it as part of his journey. That distinction matters. By naming the feeling, he removes its power. What was once buried becomes understood. This stage of Julian's life represents a quiet triumph. He didn't rewrite his past. He reinterpreted it. He allowed himself to feel compassion for the child he once was, confused, hurt, and unprotected, while also extending understanding to the adults he once blamed entirely. As the story moves toward its conclusion, one thing becomes clear. Julian Lennon's admission isn't about anger. It's about growth. The hatred he once felt did not define his life, but facing it helped him reclaim it. Of decades spent processing complex emotions, childhood grief, and the pressures of growing up in the shadow of a legendary parent. For years, the public saw him as the calm, introspective son of John Lennon, quietly navigating fame and carving out his own identity. Few understood the storm of resentment and confusion that accompanied his early years, and even fewer knew the source of that anger. Julian has emphasized that his hatred was never about malice or cruelty. It was the manifestation of loss, of attention, of connection, and of a childhood that abruptly shifted under his feet. He felt displaced, overlooked, and, at times, invisible within the very family that the world idolized. That resentment, he admits, was a defense mechanism, giving shape and direction to emotions that he otherwise could not process. As he matured, Julian recognized the need to examine his feelings honestly. The act of naming the person at the center of his resentment wasn't intended to cast blame, nor to provoke scandal. It was a necessary acknowledgement of emotional truth, one that allowed him to separate past pain from present understanding. By doing so, he reclaimed control over his own narrative, instead of letting decades of unspoken anger define him. The impact of this admission extends beyond personal reflection. It sheds light on the hidden realities of life in a famous family, the emotional gaps, the pressures to conform, and the complexity of relationships that are observed publicly but understood privately. Julian's honesty invites empathy, not judgment. It illustrates that behind every public persona, there are layers of experience that shape choices, behavior, and growth. Crucially, Julian's journey underscores the transformative power of perspective. What once felt like a singular, consuming hatred evolved into understanding, compassion, and self-awareness. By confronting his feelings rather than burying them, he was able to process grief, release resentment, and embrace his own identity separate from inherited legacy. The process was neither quick nor easy, but it has allowed him to step forward with clarity and purpose. Today, Julian's story resonates as a testament to emotional resilience. His admission is a reminder that naming pain, even decades later, is a step toward liberation. It illustrates that anger, when acknowledged and contextualized, can be transformed into insight and personal growth. For fans and observers, it adds depth to the narrative of a man who has often been viewed through the lens of celebrity and lineage rather than lived experience. Ultimately, Julian Lennon's revelation is not about the woman he once hated. It is about the journey he undertook to understand himself. It is about reclaiming emotional truth, navigating the shadows of childhood, and learning that honesty with oneself can lead to profound healing. By finally speaking openly, Julian offers a rare glimpse into the private struggles behind public life, a story of loss, reflection, and eventual reconciliation with the past. In acknowledging his emotions so candidly, Julian does not reopen old wounds. He honors them. He validates the experiences of those who have felt unseen, unheard, or displaced. And he demonstrates that even amid a legacy as towering as the Lennon name, there's room for vulnerability, growth, and the quiet triumph of understanding one's own heart.